Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Partners in Care Mental Capacity and Deprivation Liberty Safeguards webinar. We are today doing webinar 6, which is around policies, procedures and the Mental Capacity Act and how does it all fit together in practice. And I'm really happy to introduce today Lorraine Currie, who is an independent mental capacity consultant, delivering this session for us. Thank you, Lorraine.
Thanks, Karen. Okay, so yeah, just to repeat what Karen's just said today. Well, I haven't been as ambitious as Karen. I've said MCA policies and procedures. I haven't quite gone as far as to say how does it all fit together, but hopefully you will gather some of that from this session as we go along, just how the Mental Capacity Act in practice really comes into play with the policies and the procedures that we write. So it's probably a shorter session than the others that we've done. And then at the end of that, we will look at some actual policies. So it's a kind of two-part, a bit of me talking and then a little bit of practical at the end. So I'm just going to start off really in a general sense by looking at what a policy is, what a procedure is, and what's the difference. And I think it's very easy, dare I say this, to think that it's more than it is. So I think we can kind of get in a bit of a tiz about, oh, I've got to write a policy, and it feels like something that needs to have big words in it and be very complicated, and that's never a good thing in my view. So let's just have a little look at what a policy is, what a procedure is, and what's the difference before we look at the MCA in relation to policies and procedures. So in general, a policy is the big thing. It's the big idea. It's the big overarching aims and principles. So it's the great big thing that sits at the top. And then the procedures are the sort of step-by-step instructions. Well, that's a great idea. How are you going to do that idea in practice? So a policy explains about what you do and why, and then the procedure would give you the instructions about how. So how do we do that? In this place of work where we are, how do we do that? So policies tend to be more general and less likely to change. You don't want to write a policy that you've got to review every 2 minutes. You want to try and make your policy as broad as you can so that you don't have to keep returning to it. Whereas your procedure, you can change those more often. You can say, well, this is still our policy intention, but how we do it is slightly different. We might want to, that didn't work too well, so we're going to change the steps that are put into place to show us how to do that. Okay. Now, there's 2 ways of saying this. But the principle is the same. So this, is it an abbreviation or an acronym? I'm never quite sure what's what. We used to call them abbreviations, but maybe they're called acronyms these days. But the principle is keep it short and simple. You might see another way of that being expressed as keep it simple, stupid, which is also worth remembering. If it isn't simple, it's less likely to work. So write that up. Certainly for the team of PAs that support my daughter, we've got it in big writing in the office. Keep it short and simple. And then I've got a kind of little reminder to them about, is it simple? Does it feel simple to you? Did it start off simple and now it's gone somewhere really not simple? If you don't think it's simple, stop doing it and let's have a rethink. Let's go back to the drawing board. So whether it is a policy or a procedure, if you can keep it simple, it's going to be better for you, it's going to be better for your staff, and it's going to be better for the people that you support, because everyone will understand what you're writing about or what you're talking about. So you can cut that out you can't cut it out, can you? Oh yeah, you can. You can print it and cut it out and stick it on the wall. Okay. So I'm sort of going to touch on 2 different things really. One is having a policy on the MCA itself, and the other is policies which will include MCA principles. So having a policy on the MCA itself is very useful. I suspect you all have a policy on the MCA. That would be a policy which explains the broad brush implications and application actually of the MCA in your setting. So what that means for residents, what it means for staff, and how it will be implemented in your setting. But then also, all of your other policies need to be subject to the scrutiny and the impact of the MCA. So you need to be looking and asking, is it reflected? Is the MCA reflected in wider policies? And when you're doing that, all the 5 guiding principles should be followed, no matter what the subject. When I first came into post millions of years ago in Shropshire, I remember that I did some joint work with the then PCT, and they just sent me all their policies to review. Some of them were like, I started off thinking, well, there's not going to be anything about the MCA in here. You know, there were all kinds of strange policies. But I genuinely don't think I found any policy where there didn't need to be reference to the MCA in some sort of capacity, whatever the subject heading. You know, some would obviously have more detailed application of the MCA, but there would be something in almost every policy. So if you're writing a policy actually on the MCA itself, then I would suggest that it probably has to have some of these key elements. So it needs to talk about the 5 guiding principles. It needs to have the definition of the MCA. It needs to talk about the assessment of capacity. It needs to talk about who is the decision maker, when that might be different people. It needs to talk about best interests, and it needs to talk about deciding things in advance. So the provisions of the MCA that allow people to decide things in advance, particularly in the care settings, really, where you all are. And it needs to talk about the court protection. There are other things, advocacy, there's lots and lots of other things, but basically it needs to have these. But what I would say is don't rewrite the code. And then I went to myself, oh, wait a minute, because actually the code is out of date and we're all waiting for the revised MCA code to be published. We don't hold out any hope that a DOLS code will be published or an LPS code, but we do still hold on to hope about an MCA code being published. So one of the things that I personally don't like is when somebody just literally takes the whole of the code of practice and essentially turns it into their policy, because you might as well just say, see the code of practice paragraph, such a thing. You know, you don't need to rewrite the whole thing. Sorry. So one of the big things that generates consideration of the MCA is consent. So you may have a policy on consent itself, or you may have lots of different consent to X, Y, and Z policies. And you need to consider consent very carefully when you are including the language in your policy or policies. One of the things that it may just be a personal thing, I don't know. I have met 1 or 2 other people who feel as strongly as I do. I don't think you can talk about consent without talking about dissent. If you only talk about consent, then that sounds like the only option is to agree. In other words, oh, excuse me, it's my way or the highway. You know, if you talk about consent to treatment, consent to X, Y, or Z, then it doesn't appear to leave an opening for the person with capacity who actually doesn't consent. So there are 2 sides of the consent question. There's consent and dissent. So it's sometimes better to talk about a person with capacity being able to make decisions rather than talking about consent, because that's much more specific to the MCA, isn't it? MCA is about decision making. So decision making by the person, assessing whether the person can make decisions, or decision making by another. So I would suggest not presenting it as only one option, but by the same token, I would say if you do a sort of find, you press those buttons and you can find a word. If you do that with a policy to search for the word consent, anywhere that comes up, that's immediately the place where you need to start thinking about mental capacity. Because wherever there is mention of consent, if there is, then it brings with it the question of, can the person consent? If not, who can? If not, when is it best interest? So it brings with it that whole sort of mental capacity, the opening of the umbrella of mental capacity. So also anywhere we're talking about consent, we need to be considering not only the capacitors, but also the incapacitors. So in other words, we need to be looking at what about other legal decision makers and what about best interests. So I think we'll see in one of the policies, and they're very good on the whole, the two policies that I've looked at, but somewhere it talks about decisions with capacity or best interest decisions, but it's missed out the middle bit, which is decision making by another legally appointed person. So in other words, you know that what I mean by that is somebody who has LPA for finance, or LPA for care decisions, or is a deputy for finance, or a deputy for health and welfare decisions. So there is a middle step, the person with capacity, the legally appointed decision maker, or best interest decisions. The other thing that we need to always be thinking about when we're looking at policies, and therefore thinking about IMCAs, is thinking about advocacy, is the role of the IMCA. So when we're writing policies about certain types of care or treatment, that brings with it, again, that's got a sort of bell of its own that says, have you involved the appropriate advocate? So the MCA introduced the independent mental capacity advocate as a new advocacy role, and there is certain mandatory referral criteria. So serious medical treatment or change of accommodation, where the person is unbefriended, without family or friends who can get involved in the best interest decision-making process, then we need to make a referral to an IMCA. And then there is an optional referral criteria around care plan reviews or adult safeguarding. And in relation to adult safeguarding, the requirement of not having family or friends is not applicable. So again, have you got in your policy reference to relevant advocacy at the appropriate point in time? It has only got the voiceability logo on there on the next slide, I think. Well, I won't think, I'll press the button and we'll have a look. I'm aware that Telford and Wrekin don't use voiceability, they use Power. So put Power's details there as well as voiceability. So if you Google either of those, you will get the link to make a referral for either Power or voiceability. Okay, your policies on the MCA also need to make reference to the ways that people can plan for the future. And we've already done a session on this, I think, unless I'm losing the plot on what we've done. So we've talked about becoming an LPA or becoming a deputy for finance and for health and welfare. So these are the ways that people can plan for the future. So it's really important that you know, and that you have policy decisions around finding out and recording, hopefully as part of your admission protocols, whether people have made a decision to select someone as an LPA, or whether a deputy has already been appointed for the person. So it's really important that your policies reference both the role of those people, but also their existence in terms of your recording and admission. And then secondly, the ability of people to make advanced decisions to refuse treatment. So some of you may have policies, and I think one of the policies we've looked at and we'll look at the end of the session is around treatment, care and treatment decisions. So it's very important that they make reference to the person's ability to have already decided in advance that there's certain treatment that they don't want. And that might be sort of general, or it might be life-sustaining treatment. So you need to know what it is they've decided and where you can see that, if it is a written document or if it's just a verbal decision, what you do about making sure that that is recorded. So these options that are available to people do need to be within your suite of policies, and certainly recorded really on admission, because it's really crucial information. There is, and I was going to put a link to it, but I see that it's just gone round for its sort of final consultation. So what we can probably do is either put it in the ever-growing March newsletter, or we can send it round, or just make it available on the Partners in Care website. So there is a Shropshire and Telford multi-agency MCA policy. If you look on certainly the Shropshire Council website, there's a link to the old version. I can't think it's going to have significantly changed, but it is really useful to have a multi-agency policy across all organisations, and Partners in Care was a signatory to that, and I'm sure they will still continue to be. But it's a very useful document, and you can, by adopting that, almost do away with the need to write your own in terms of this big wide policy on the MCA itself. And you might then be able to link your other policies to it and focus more on writing procedures about how you implement the various aspects of this multi-agency MCA policy. So watch this space. There will be a new one shortly. So because we're in a situation where we're recording and nobody wants to speak, you're probably not going to answer this. But if anybody does want to not speak but type into chat, I'd be very interested to know just the breadth of policies, because I was stunned when I first started reviewing them, you know, what to do when a resident goes missing, policies about gifts, a whole host of policies that, you know, you never really think about until you're in that situation. So it would be interesting to me, but not to anybody who might listen to this in the future who won't get to see it, but just some of the sense of the wider policies that you have in your organisation. And then maybe at the end we can, when we stop recording, we can have a chat about whether there might be a need to view those through an MCA lens. So some of the ones that I have come across and been involved in reviewing in the past have been policies around medicines management, safeguarding policies, which of course I don't need to think about because Karen's the expert in that, infection control, care of the deceased, confidentiality, eating and drinking, end of life, and data protection. They're just some of the sort of general policies, and I would say all of those are going to have an MCA element to them if we view them through the lens of the MCA. That's probably not an exhaustive list, so if you've got anything different to that, then stick it in the chat, and Karen told you how to get to the chat, and I'll keep an eye on whether anything's there at the end. Okay, so rather than focusing on a policy on the MCA, we're going to talk a little bit about how to look at all of your other policies through the lens of the MCA and to use the 5 guiding principles to guide you. So quick reminder of what those 5 guiding principles are. So in their summary form, the first guiding principle is that we assume capacity. And again, that's a very useful starting point for you in your decisions about admission and all of those decisions that fall to be made once someone is a resident with yourself, or once you are supporting someone in whatever setting they might be. The second principle is about supported decision making. And these are principles which don't get us yet to the starting block for assessing capacity, because what we want to do is support people to make their own decisions. So having a policy, or certainly a kind of framework around supported decision making, how you will support residents to make those decisions that they can make, is really, really important in your line of work. You kind of want the decisions for someone to be at the end of the line. You want to be looking at how you support people in as many of these small decisions that you deal with day by day. How you support them to make their own decisions is absolutely crucial. And then thirdly, we know that the third guiding principle is around unwise decision making, and the fact that someone should not be treated as lacking capacity because they make an unwise decision. And we're quite glad about that, aren't we, as human beings, because we have all made unwise decisions. It might have been an unwise decision to put masking tape around my glasses, but my first thought was super glue. And my husband said, no, I wouldn't do that, because then they might not be able to fix them when you take them to the shop. So I accepted his supported decision making and went for the masking tape model. But we are all glad that we're not judged to lack capacity on the basis of making an unwise decision. And that's the same, isn't it, for everyone to whom you provide support. But there are some people who we know do lack capacity, decision-specific capacity, and then we're required to act in the person's best interests. When I say we, it may not be us. It may be somebody who is acting as an LPA or a deputy. They're still required to act in the person's best interest. Principle 4 is still a guiding principle. If there isn't another decision maker, then it would be us. And the fifth thing, and the final thing we're required to do, is to make sure we look for the least restrictive way of achieving the outcome that needs to be achieved, or the least restrictive decision that we can make, the outcome which least interferes with the person's rights and freedom of action. So really, that should sort of tie everything up. If we start by assuming they can make their own decisions, we support them in that. We recognise that sometimes they might be unwise. We always act in the person's best interest, and we always choose the least restrictive option. Everything should be great, really, if we're using those 5 guiding principles to guide us in the work that we do. And in this session, guide us when we're writing policies and procedures. So there's a lot of words on these slides, and try as I might, couldn't find a way of putting a humorous picture on. So I am just going to go through them. I've taken this from another document that I wrote a while ago, which is about commissioning in an MCA compliant way. But when I looked at it, I thought, actually, most of these questions are relevant for doing a review of your policies and procedures. So bear with me in that it's just slides with lots of words on. But for each of the 5 guiding principles, what I've given you here is a set of questions that you could run through to view your policy and then see if it is MCA compliant. So we're starting with the first guiding principle, which is an assumption of capacity. And the first thing to ask yourself is the assumption of capacity evident in admission policies and throughout? So is the way you operate right from the beginning of an admission, does it support and promote the assumption of capacity? not going to answer any of these questions, of course, because these are things that you can perhaps print out. And if you decide to review your policies, you can use this as a kind of checklist. Is the assumption of capacity clear in your ethos and practice? So do you have a value statement, or do you have an operating model? And if so, is it clear that it's the assumption of capacity, is that really clear in your ethos and in your practice? Are people treated as autonomous individuals? So are people able to make the decision that is right for them as an individual human being? It might be right for me, but it wouldn't be right for you, and it wouldn't be right for the next person, because I am an autonomous individual. So are we making decisions not as a blanket, which is never right? Are we making decisions that treat people as autonomous individuals? Does your service aim to enable and empower? Or is the emphasis on protection and paternalism? Not always easy questions to answer these, but this is a sort of reflective challenge, really. Are you striving to enable and empower the people that you support? Does the service have an understanding of when it's necessary to assess a person's capacity? So, okay, you're very proudly promoting the assumption of capacity, but do you know when that's reached its logical limits? Do you know when it's time to carry out an assessment of capacity? Do you have paperwork and processes that reflect a difference between day-to-day decision-making and complex decision-making? So that sort of day-to-day, what to wear, what to eat, nobody expects to see a long, complex mental capacity assessment about those decisions every time they need to be taken. Or you'd have to employ, you know, another 5 million staff, wouldn't you, to cope with all those little day-to-day decisions. So have you got paperwork that reflects day-to-day decisions are different from big complex decision making? The decision to come and live in a residential setting, the decision to have maybe one-off bespoke medical treatment. Some of these decisions that really only get made once, they're slightly different and would demand a different type of approach, still applying the MCA and its principles. Do staff and managers demonstrate an understanding of when a formal assessment is needed and how to record it? So would you have paperwork for a formal assessment that you wouldn't expect to be filled in every time somebody chooses a meal from a menu card? Is the organisation clear when a person has the right to say no, and when this might arise from a lack of capacity? So is there clarity about a capacitous person can say yes or no, but a person might say no, and that might be because they actually lack capacity to make that decision? Are staff trained and able to apply the principles of the MCA? Is MCA compliant practice an integral part of staff supervision, mentoring and evaluation? Does the training, induction and refresher training policy include the MCA? Does staff induction include the MCA? And does the organisation offer choice to residents, that is, not staff? Well, I suppose staff need choice as well, but different in this context, which is real and valid. Is there the option for somebody to say, yes, please, or no, thank you? So that's the first guiding principle. So when we then look at supported decision-making, a set of questions. Is an appropriate level of detail kept in relation to a person's communication needs? So how do we know how to support them with decision-making if we don't know enough about their communication needs? Are basic matters such as the wearing of hearing aids and glasses by those who need them given prominence? Is the organisation, are your staff aware how to contact interpreters if they're needed? Are there a variety of communication methods available for staff to use to enhance communication? Are people given the right information at the right time in the right way to enhance their ability to make their own decisions? So again, from a policy level, something about communication, supported decision making, communication aids, other types of support, such as speech and language therapists or interpreters. Is there an ethos which supports decision making rather than one that seeks to impose decision making on people? Are staff appropriately trained to communicate with people who might have difficulty communicating? So all of those are some prompts, some guides to whether you are incorporating supported decision making and whether that appears in your policies and in your procedures. Unwise decision making. Does the organisation recognise that a person cannot be deemed to lack capacity simply because of an unwise decision? Well, all of you do here now because we've already discussed it. Is there an ethos which allows for and accepts some element of risk in order to promote autonomy? And that would be interesting to see how you have policies on risk management and the like, and whether it does have that element of sort of swings and roundabouts. There's an element of risk in order to promote autonomy. Are people encouraged to reflect on their actions with the support of staff? Sometimes a person might make an unwise decision, but is able to sit down and unpick that with the support of staff. Are you flexible enough to adapt to a range of different decision-making abilities? So some people might have very limited skills, might be an eye point or a tick or a cross, but that is a very low-level form of decision-making, but nonetheless decision-making. And are your staff trained to recognise the inherent rights and value of all people, whether they have a disability or not? Then we come to acting in the person's best interest. Is there a culture which clearly promotes autonomy and choice, but recognises when decisions must be made for others? Do your staff fully understand and apply best interest decision-making principles? Do you have evidence to clearly demonstrate that the statutory checklist for best interest decision-making is followed when necessary? Is there a nice, clear record that is there in your policy on the MCA and the documents and procedure that supports that? Is there a clear record when best interest decisions are made? And is the service, its managers and staff, able to demonstrate how people are involved in all decisions about them, whether they have capacity or not? Are you able to demonstrate that appropriate consultation around best interest is always carried out? So with relatives and family and friends. Can you show how people participate in decisions about them? And is it clear from the way you have recorded decisions what the person's wishes, feelings and values were and whether they could be adhered to or not? And the big one really, which often causes some challenges, are decision makers clearly identified with an appropriate level of responsibility? Do you know when it's you, so to speak? Do you know when it's not you and it's maybe the social worker, or when it's not you and it's not the social worker because there's an LPA or a deputy in place? Oh, maybe that was there twice. So the final one of the 5 guiding principles asks, is there a statement or a policy in relation to people's human rights? It'd be interesting to know if any of you have sort of human rights based policies. Are your staff trained in the Human Rights Act? Do you have a clear policy in relation to restraint, which is MCA compliant? And restraint might be one of those things that we might want to look at in future seminars, webinars, thinking about it. Does the service have a clear understanding of everything that might amount to restraint, including chemical restraint, diversion and dissuasion, physical restraint such as mats and lap belts, monitoring devices such as sensors, and locked doors which restrict freedom of movement? All of these things are part of looking at your policies and procedures through the lens of the least restrictive option. So a real need to understand what restriction and restraint is. Are your risk assessments clearly documented and regularly reviewed and updated? Do you have a clear policy that restrictions are regularly reviewed to assess if they can be lessened prior to making an application for dogs? Are staffing levels appropriate to avoid unnecessary monitoring? Is there a person-centred approach to care which provides a rationale for every restriction in place? E.g., why is a door locked? Why does a person have 2-to-1 support? And is there an ethos within the service which endeavours to reduce all restrictions in place and promote liberty, autonomy and well-being? So quite a lot to look at there, quite a lot to consider before we move on to unpicking some policies. I think I've got one final slide and then perhaps we'll stop the recording. So when you're looking at general review of policies, almost everything needs to acknowledge some aspect of the MCA. Anywhere consent is mentioned, look for MCA compliance. Anywhere decisions are needed, look for MCA compliance. Anywhere the MCA is mentioned, it shouldn't now still be described as a 2-stage test. Anywhere you have a capacity tool, it should begin with the functional test. All documentation should have reference to appointed decision makers, that is LPA and deputy, and no documentation should talk about next of kin. So if you've got NOK, it means nothing of the kind. There's no such concept. Nothing of the kind. Okay, so at that point, I'm going to say thanks for listening to me talking a lot about the MCA and how to review your policies and procedures. And I hope it's given you food for thought.
And just before you stop your slides, Lorraine, I was just going to end with that on the slide. I just want to say on behalf of Partners in Care, thanks for that. And I'm sure that any adult social care organisation, whether you're working in residential settings or out in the community, would find that useful, because there's quite a lot on a kind of practical level really to take you through with that. So I've just going to stop the recording now, and this will be available on our Partners in Care YouTube channel. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.